Okay, just to kind of look back a bit, this is the image for the full color landscape. Started out with a quick pencil sketch of some areas and initiated some landmarks first. I'm going to go ahead and pick up with some more of that, but one thing I did want to point out, please don't feel like you need to go buy these, but I remember when talking about watercolor pencils, I also mentioned that there are watercolor crayons. So this is the water soluble, but they're not actually watercolors in the traditional sense like the colored pencils. They're actually referred to as water soluble wax pastels. So, you know, we have science to thank for these kinds of strange miracles where you can combine watercolor with wax, which is traditionally seen to be of the same consistency and quality as regular crayons or oil pastels, but chemically these have been altered to actually become soluble in water. So they can be a nice alternative for watercolor material and drawing. When you're using some watercolor and colored pencils, these provide a nice alternative. So I may use a couple of these today just to show you how they work. This is a small set of 10, and this is about 23 bucks. So they're kind of pricey, but you can see they're going to last you a long time. They come in a metal tin, but just to warn you, please don't leave these in the heat. I used to have these before, and I made the mistake of leaving them in the car with my other materials, and then they all kind of just fused together and made them difficult to use. I had to break them apart, and they were never quite the same after that. So if you're going to spend that much money, please make sure you take care of them. The brand name is Neocolor. Okay? All right, so I'm going to show you a little bit of that later. So what I'm going to do next is kind of just fill in some more gaps here. The nice thing about watercolor in landscape is that you're dealing with really large, broad areas, and that can be interesting, especially just having come from dealing with subject matter of the still life, which tends to be very precise. I'm going to put a little water in this area where we've got some ground dirt. So I'm going to go ahead and run some of this water in here, and I'm going to lay some of that color in, which is like a burnt sienna, almost like a sand color. So let me pick up some of that, and you can see our collaborators are back again. Starting to get on my nerves, but hopefully when school starts I'll be able to take care of that. This is a very irregular placement. I'm going to keep a big brush handy with some water on it in case this becomes deposited a little too heavily, and I can move it around with the larger brush. This may not really become as evident until some of that green gets put in to offset the warmth of the sienna color right now. There's still a lot of white paper evident, and of course that's going to change. There's also some back in this shadow area, and make sure I get some back in there. I can also do a little flicking. So I'm going to do that right now just to get a little texture in here. What actually works really well for splattering is a brush with a little stiffer quality to it. Lets you find, let's say, in a toothbrush. So that can be an effective tool to make use of for this technique. I'm going to reach for one of newer, stiffer brushes that I picked up that are really cheap that I wanted to use just for this. Water. You know, you can see where some of the specks start to get a little heavy, and that's why you want to keep this bigger brush with a little water in it, just to kind of strike it down a notch so it doesn't become quite so consistent. I'm going to let that dry, and I'm also going to brush a little of this lighter stuff right around in here as well. And even though there's grass here, I want to tuck a little of this underneath, because you know, in actuality, that's what happens. It grows, the grass grows out of the dirt, so we want a little of that color there. Now, while that's setting, I'm going to come back to my horizon line once again, and I'm going to put a little of that green and run it across. It's a little lighter, but still, I think I'd like to reinforce that landmark. So I'm going to pick up a little green, and I'm going to try to not have my head get in the way, but this falls under the category of detail. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of run this around right to here. Use this is a much finer horizon line here. So it's going to have quite a difference in weight visually. And I'm just going to pull it around. A tall tree here or there, just to kind of vary the horizon. I'm going to bring it all the way down to this cluster of trees here. And suggest it as being back behind. And have it meet up over here. Okay, so now I got another landmark. I'm going to run a little more color through that. Go back to the beginning. And I just picked up a little more sienna with the green just to change it up some. And I'm not going to hit everything, but I'm just going to touch here and there just so that that green has a little variation in it, so it doesn't look so mechanical. Okay, that's good there. Now while that's drying out, I'm going to hit a little green in the trees now, just to give them a little more life. I'm going to actually first take a yellow and in my palette I've got a trace of the yellow that I used previously, and it has a touch of green in it. So I'm going to use a slightly dingier green first. I'm going to kind of work it in here. Just right on top of that initial dark value that I used. I just noticed some color that was slightly different, not quite as green. I'm gonna use a little of that. Okay, I'm also gonna delve once again into a little bit of black and again provide some variation and intensify the dark that I started out with to get something that's a bit more intense in value. I'm gonna leave my brush slightly dirty so that it picks up a little color. I'm just gonna poke the brush around in here again. We've got a real strong shadow because it's a lot of sunlight, and this is creating a much stronger contrast with the light and shadow patterns. So I want to make sure that the leaves and the trees look and feel a little fuller by making sure that we're creating a sufficient amount of contrast in shadow. And you can see how I'm doing this landscape feature here in the trees is I'm not painting, so to speak. I'm tapping paint in. Just letting the brush and the unevenness, I'm holding the brush from the very back. And that way you can get a variety of and more natural appearing marks instead of something that looks mechanical or pressured into being exact, because nature doesn't have that kind of quality about it. Again, always good to remember we're using the photograph. We are not replicating it. Okay, it's very important that you remember that. If you're replicating, then you're not going to enjoy the painting process. What we're replicating is color intensity or color muted color, if the case be. That's what we're replicating. We're not replicating the actual image to make it look photographic. We are using. Now again, just as in the case with the sienna in the ground, we're probably not going to really be able to notice our work here in the tree until we get the blue in the background, the sky, to help set it off. Now I've got really not diluted, but smaller marks in some of the tree texture here. So again, I'm just going to use the tip of the brush and kind of tap and dab with it to create another quality of that texture. Where here, there's a lot of gathering of stuff, so I can use a broader, flatter part of the brush, even though I'm still poking. But when you come to these outer areas, the outer fringes of the tree branches, you might want to be a little bit more cautious about using the tip and tapping to create a different type of mark. And of course, I'm going to resist spackling because you really don't want to get a lot out into the sky area, because that's going to be hard to cover up. Let me put a few of these out in here. Okay. I may come back after the sky is done and even put in a few more of this finer texture in your leaves. even after the sky is in there, that's not going to be a problem. It'll create more of an illusion that the leaves are out, overlapping the sky. Do need a little dark in here. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to come back to this foreground area. Since I've got green, I'm going to go ahead and lay some green down in there. I'm going to use a big brush this time. I'm going to lighten my green out of the tube with some yellow. Once again, I'm going to keep a brush that's wet handy in case I need to agitate the surface a little. This shadow is on top of the grass, so I need to make sure I run some of this green through there. So you see how the initial mark is stiff, but when I agitate it, that stiff edge goes away. Okay, so that's the other reason for having a secondary brush, is to be able to take those initial strong marks out of your surface. Yeah, I'm not worried about painting it evenly. I'm jabbing and tapping, and that's going to aid in the promotion of ground texture without having to do it painstakingly with the brush. Again, here I'm going to take a little of that sharpness out just by tapping over it. Let me come back over in here. This looks a little lighter, so I'm going to water this down some. Maybe throw in a little more yellow back in here. There we go. And in here. Brush it around some. Work some into that shrubbery. And in evaluating this as I'm working, I can still see that there's some darkening in the shadow down here that has to come. So that'll be forthcoming. And then come back over in this area and start to set up the distant edge in this grassy area. Again, holding the brush almost parallel to the paper. When I'm tapping the brush this way, of course, it's going to leave a little bit of an edge, and that's going to be advantageous because that looks like a patch of taller grass that is sprouting upwards. So it gives a little texture simply by how you hold the brush. I'm going to pull a little of the green over the ground to make it more natural in appearance, so that the dirt isn't meeting the green and stopping, but that there's some overlapping going on here. I don't know where that black came from, but it's a little upsetting to see it, but I'm going to make it work here. Okay. Pull it out and maybe sprinkle a little of that dark somewhere else so that it doesn't seem out of place, which it was. Just came out of nowhere. Actually, there is a dark patch right here, so that's going to help. I'm going to dip into a little of the black. Wet brush. Okay. I'm really looking forward to getting that green in there. I'm going to once again go to the background, pick up my black and run a little stronger black over some of that green. So I still, I'm looking at the photo. Remember, I used to say this in drawing class, and I also like to echo this when I'm teaching painting, especially when you're working from a photograph or from life, is you never stop looking, never stop evaluating what you're working with. Okay, when I first started this horizon line, it was like 95% of the paper was white. So things are going to look strong with all that white there. But now, as more color is getting filled in, then I can start to see, well, wait a minute, it's not as dark as it was on day one. So now I need to come back and increase the contrast by getting a little of that more intense dark that we see there. Okay. And I may come back and hit it again. Once the blue in the sky is there, I may want to take another look at that. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and work on this a little more. And we come back, I'll probably have the water done and maybe initiate the sky.